Nina Roberts was no stranger to danger. As one of the most fearless investigative journalists in the city, she had made a name for herself by uncovering deep-rooted corruption, exposing powerful figures, and pursuing the truth, no matter the cost. For years, her work had been a beacon of hope in a city marred by deceit, but it had also earned her dangerous enemies. And now, it seemed, her most perilous story yet was about to unfold. The city was alive with the hum of an ordinary afternoon. Cars honked as they crawled through traffic, and pedestrians moved in hurried waves along the busy streets. From the window of her taxi, Nina watched the familiar skyline of the city fade into the distance as they drove toward a quieter district. But her mind wasn't on the passing scenery, it was on the weighty flash drive hidden inside the lining of her jacket. It had all started 6 months ago. Nina had been working on a routine story about city budget mismanagement when she stumbled upon something far more sinister, a web of corruption that extended deep into the mayor's office. As she dug deeper, she realized this wasn't just about misuse of public funds. It was a sophisticated criminal network involving police brutality, bribery, and intimidation tactics. At the heart of it all was Mayor Garrett Sloan, a man who had built his public persona as a champion of justice and reform. But behind the curtain of his slick speeches and carefully crafted image was a leader steeped in criminal activity. Nina knew the dangers of pursuing this story. In the past, other reporters had tried to dig into the mayor's dealings, only to be met with sudden career shifts, mysterious accidents, or worse. But Nina was different. She had been raised to fight for what she believed in, and she wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. She had been working in the shadows, gathering every piece of evidence she could find, and now she had what she needed to blow the case wide open. Her sources had been clear this story went beyond politics, it was personal. And now that she was ready to go public, she knew the risks had multiplied. It wasn't just her career on the line, it was her life. The taxi came to a halt in front of the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a decoy meeting point, not the real destination for her interview with Mayor Sloan, but part of the elaborate steps she had to take to avoid being followed. After her discovery of the mayor's ties to corrupt law enforcement, she knew she was being watched. Every move she made had to be calculated. Nina stepped out of the cab, glancing around the quiet industrial area. She pulled her phone from her pocket and checked the time, still an hour to go before her interview with the mayor. She walked calmly toward the warehouse, pretending to enter as if this was her destination. Inside, she'd be safe for now. But she wasn't planning to stay long. She had another meeting to get to, one that was far more dangerous than the one she'd arranged with Sloan. This was her chance to meet with a key informant, someone inside the mayor's circle who had been feeding her information for the past few months. They had never met in person, and the informant had only agreed to this meeting because things were heating up. The pressure was building, and Nina knew time was running out. If she didn't move fast, she'd lose her chance to expose the mayor before he found a way to cover his tracks. Inside the dimly lit warehouse, the air was heavy with the smell of dust and age. Crates were stacked in the corners, and the echo of her footsteps bounced off the concrete walls. Nina scanned the room, checking for any signs of surveillance. She moved quickly, her senses sharp, listening for anything out of the ordinary. After a few minutes of pacing and double-checking her surroundings, she heard the faint shuffle of footsteps approaching. Nina tensed, her heartbeat quickening. Was it her contact or someone else? She ducked behind a crate, holding her breath. The steps grew louder, and a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, his face obscured by a hooded jacket. He looked around cautiously before stepping further into the room. Nina stepped out slowly, keeping her hands visible. "You must be Roberts," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. That depends. You got what I need, she replied, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for months. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black case. Everything you've been looking for. But be careful. Once you have this, you're marked. Nina took the case, her eyes narrowing. I've been marked for a long time. What's one more target on my back? The man gave a curt nod and turned to leave, but paused before reaching the door. Watch your back, Roberts. You're in deeper than you think. The mayor's just the tip of the iceberg. Nina watched him disappear into the shadows, her mind racing. She had expected to find corruption, but this was something bigger, more dangerous than she could have imagined. The case felt heavier in her hands now, as if it contained not just evidence, but the weight of a city's darkest secrets. She opened it carefully, revealing the flash drive inside. It was simple, almost nondescript, but she knew the data it held could destroy lives, including her own, if she wasn't careful. As she closed the case and slipped it into her jacket, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. We're watching. Time's up. Nina's blood ran cold. She was out of time. Without hesitating, she slipped out of the warehouse and headed toward the main road. Her interview with Mayor Sloan was scheduled to take place in a luxury hotel across town, and she needed to get there fast. But now she had a new plan. This interview wouldn't be a simple QA, it would be a confrontation. She was going to expose the mayor in front of his own team, but she had to be smart about it. The city's pulse quickened as Nina walked into the street, blending into the crowd. Her steps were calm, but her mind was racing. She was walking straight into the lion's den, but she knew there was no turning back. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as she left the warehouse behind, the weight of the black case almost burning a hole in her jacket. She moved with purpose, blending into the busy streets as if she were just another passerby. But she knew better. Eyes were on her. She could feel it, the invisible gaze of someone, somewhere, tracking her every move. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Don't make us come for you. Nina clenched her jaw. Whoever was behind the messages had been watching her closely for weeks. The subtle threats had begun as soon as she had started to make headway in her investigation, but they had intensified in the past few days. And now, they were brazen enough to try to scare her just before the biggest interview of her career. But fear wasn't going to stop her. Not now. She flagged down a taxi and gave the driver the address of the hotel where the interview with Mayor Sloan was supposed to take place. As she sank into the back seat, she forced herself to calm down, breathing slowly and deeply. Her eyes flicked to the side mirror, scanning the cars behind them. Nothing out of the ordinary. But she knew better than to trust appearances. The people targeting her weren't amateurs. They were professionals, likely ex-military or corrupt law enforcement, the kind of people who could follow someone without ever being seen. "Everything okay back there?" the taxi driver asked, catching her gaze in the mirror. Nina nodded curtly. "Fine, just a long day." The driver gave a non-committal grunt and focused back on the road. Nina appreciated the silence. It gave her time to think. Her mind raced over the events of the past few weeks. The discovery of the mayor's connections to organized crime. The corrupt deals made with city contractors, funneling money into offshore accounts. And then there was the police force, more than a few officers deep in Sloan's pocket, willing to do whatever it took to protect their powerful benefactor. Winters was one of them, a particularly dangerous enforcer who was known for his brutality. She had encountered him before during an unrelated investigation, and the memory still left a bitter taste in her mouth. Now, it seemed, their paths were destined to cross again. The closer she got to the truth, the more she realized that Sloan wasn't just using his political power to enrich himself. He was building something far more dangerous, a network of influence that extended beyond the city into places Nina hadn't yet fully uncovered. And that terrified her. If she didn't act now, this web of corruption would only grow stronger, more untouchable. But as the cab pulled up to the sleek, glass-fronted hotel, a different kind of fear gripped her. What if she wasn't ready? What if, in her drive to expose Sloan, she had underestimated just how far these people were willing to go? What if she didn't make it out of this interview alive? Nina shook the thoughts away. She didn't have the luxury of doubt. Not anymore. She had chosen this path, and now she had to see it through. She paid the driver and stepped out of the cab, walking briskly toward the hotel entrance. The lobby was pristine, all marble floors and polished brass fixtures, with wealthy patrons lounging in plush chairs, sipping expensive coffee. Nina's presence went unnoticed, just as she intended. She didn't stop at the front desk to check in, heading straight for the elevators at the back of the lobby. As the doors slid shut behind her, she took a moment to pull out her phone and check her notes. Everything she needed was there, the questions she would ask, the evidence she would reveal at just the right moment. The interview was supposed to be a routine conversation about Sloan's re-election campaign, but she had other plans. She was going to turn the interview into an ambush, catching the mayor off guard and forcing him to answer for his crimes on camera. Her finger hovered over the recording app on her phone, but before she could press it, something in the reflection of the elevator's mirrored walls caught her eye. A man in a dark suit, standing just outside the hotel, watching her. His face was obscured by sunglasses, and though he made no move to follow her inside, Nina felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Was he with the mayor? Or was he someone else entirely? The elevator dinged, and Nina stepped out on the top floor, shaking off the feeling of being watched. She couldn't afford to be paranoid. Not now. The hallway was eerily quiet as she approached the suite where the interview was set to take place. The hotel staff had been instructed to give them privacy, no interruptions, no curious onlookers. That had been Mayor Sloan's request. And though it made sense for a high-profile interview, Nina couldn't help but feel that it was designed to keep prying eyes away from whatever was about to happen. She knocked twice on the door. A moment later, it opened, revealing Sloan's press secretary, a slim, serious woman in a black blazer. She gave Nina a curt nod before stepping aside to let her in. "Mayor Sloan is ready for you," the woman said, her voice clipped. "He's expecting you to keep this professional." Nina raised an eyebrow. Of course. The suite was even more opulent than the rest of the hotel. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, and the soft glow of the afternoon sun bathed the room in warm light. Mayor Garrett Sloan stood at the far end of the room, near the windows, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city he claimed to serve. He didn't turn around as Nina entered, and for a brief moment she wondered if he even knew she was there. But then he spoke. "Come, Ms. Roberts," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "It's been a long time since we've had the pleasure of speaking, hasn't it?" Nina set her bag down on the small table in the center of the room and pulled out her notebook, her fingers brushing against the hidden compartment where the flash drive lay. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "It has," she replied. "I've been busy." Sloan finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and his silver hair was neatly combed, giving him the appearance of a man who was completely in control. But Nina could see the cracks, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. She wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. "I'm sure you have," Sloane said, moving to sit across from her. "But let's get straight to the point, shall we? I know you didn't come here to ask about my campaign." Nina's pulse quickened. So he knew. He had been expecting her to confront him, maybe even prepared for it. But what he didn't know was how much she had on him. "I didn't," she said, flipping open her notebook. "I came here to talk about your connections, the ones you've been trying to keep hidden for years." Sloane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My connections," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Nina met his gaze, unflinching. "The corruption, the bribery, the extortion. You've built your entire administration on lies, and I have the proof." For a split second, she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that same cold, calculating smile. "You're making a dangerous accusation, MS. Roberts," he said softly. "And I'd be very careful if I were you." Nina didn't flinch. She wasn't here to be intimidated. She was here to bring him down. Nina could feel the tension between them tightening like a noose. Mayor Sloane's eyes bore into her, a mixture of arrogance and barely concealed disdain. It was as though he was daring her to make the first move, to pull out the evidence she claimed to have. But Nina wasn't going to be baited so easily. She had learned long ago that in this kind of battle, it was about control of the narrative, of the timing, of the atmosphere. Sloane might think he was the one in charge here, but he had no idea just how deep Nina's investigation had gone. Taking a deep breath, she leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Dangerous accusations? No, Mayor. What's dangerous is what you've been doing to this city. The backroom deals, the money laundering through public contracts, the intimidation of your political rivals. I've spent the last year gathering evidence. And I have enough to not only end your career but to put you and several of your closest allies behind bars." She watched his reaction closely. For a brief moment she saw something flicker across his face. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was the faintest shadow of concern. Sloane shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, his hands resting on his knee. He was trying to project calm, but Nina knew better. He was calculating, figuring out his next move, trying to assess just how much she really knew. "I see," he said after a long pause, his voice dripping with feigned politeness. "You've been very busy, MS Roberts. But if you've really been investigating for as long as you say, you must know that these so-called connections of mine are nothing more than rumors. You won't find anything solid enough to pin on me." Nina smiled, but it was a cold, humorless smile. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder, sliding it across the table toward him. "Go ahead, take a look." Sloane hesitated for a moment before picking up the folder. He opened it and began to flip through the pages, his expression unreadable. But as he continued to read, Nina saw the shift. His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck tensed. The folder contained just a small fraction of the evidence she had gathered, enough to rattle him, but not enough to reveal her full hand. She wanted him to know that she had the goods, but she wasn't going to show all her cards just yet. When Sloane finally looked up from the folder, his eyes were cold, devoid of the slick charm he had worn like a mask. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've outsmarted me." Nina held his gaze, unflinching. I don't have to outsmart you, Mayor. You did this to yourself. Sloan let out a short, humorless laugh. He tossed the folder back onto the table and stood up, walking over to the window. He stared out at the city below, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and Nina could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She knew he was trying to intimidate her, to make her second-guess herself, but she wasn't going to back down. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost contemplative. You know, MS. Roberts, I've been in this game a long time. I've seen people like you come and go. Ambitious, righteous journalists who think they can bring down the big bad politician with a few pieces of paper and some angry headlines. But do you know what happens to people like that? Nina didn't answer. She knew he wasn't expecting her to. He turned to face her, his expression hard. They disappear. They get crushed under the weight of the machine they're trying to fight. You think you're special? You're not. You're just another cog in the wheel. Nina's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Is that a threat? Sloan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's not a threat, MS. Roberts. It's a reality. You've put yourself in a very dangerous position, and if you think I'm the only one who's going to come after you, you're sorely mistaken. Before Nina could respond, the door to the suite opened, and Sloane's press secretary stepped inside, her face pale. So she said, her voice shaking slightly, "There's someone here to see you." Sloane frowned. "I'm in the middle of something. Whoever it is, tell them to wait." The woman hesitated, glancing at Nina before stepping closer to Sloane and lowering her voice. "It's Officer Winters. He says it's urgent." Nina felt her stomach drop at the mention of the name. Derek Winters. She had crossed paths with him before, and it had been far from pleasant. Winters was one of the most corrupt officers in the city, known for using excessive force and bullying anyone who got in his way. He was also one of Sloane's most loyal enforcers. Sloane's expression darkened. "Send him in." The press secretary nodded and quickly left the room. Moments later, the door opened again, and Officer Derek Winters strode inside. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a square jaw and cold, piercing eyes. His police uniform was immaculate, and his movements were deliberate, calculated. He exuded authority, but it was the kind of authority that came from fear, not respect. Nina Roberts Winters said, as he entered, his voice a low growl, "You've been busy, haven't you?" Nina's hands instinctively tightened around her notebook. She didn't like the way Winters was looking at her like a predator sizing up its prey. She had heard the stories about him, the way he handled problems for Sloane, and she had no doubt that he would have no qualms about doing whatever it took to protect his boss. "What do you want?" Winters, she asked, keeping her voice steady. Winters ignored the question, turning to Sloane instead. "We've got a problem," he said bluntly. Sloane's frown deepened. "What kind of problem?" "One of our guys down at the precinct intercepted a communication," Winters said, his voice low. "There's a leak. Someone inside your office has been feeding information to the press. And if I had to guess, I'd say they've been working with her." He jerked his head toward Nina. Sloane's eyes flashed with anger. "What kind of information?" Winters pulled a small device from his pocket and handed it to Sloane. "Encrypted emails. Names, dates, transactions. It's all there. We haven't decoded everything yet, but it's enough to raise alarms." Nina's heart pounded in her chest. This was worse than she had anticipated. She had expected Sloane to be angry, to try and intimidate her, but this was something else entirely. If they knew about the leak, then they were already several steps ahead of her. Sloane's face hardened as he looked over the device. Who's behind this? We don't know yet, Winters said, but we've got people looking into it, and we'll find them. Sloane's jaw clenched, and he turned back to Nina, his eyes cold. It seems you've made more enemies than you realize, Ms. Roberts. Nina's mind raced. She had to think quickly. She couldn't afford to let them know just how close she was to the truth, but she also couldn't afford to give away too much. She needed time to figure out her next move, time to regroup. You can try to scare me all you want, she said, standing up from her seat. But I'm not backing down. You think you can control this city forever? People are starting to wake up. They're starting to see through your lies. And when the truth comes out, there won't be anywhere for you to hide. Sloane's lips curled into a sneer. Brave words, Ms. Roberts. But words won't save you. Before Nina could respond, Winters moved quickly, stepping toward her and grabbing her arm in a rough, forceful grip. You're coming with me, he said, his voice low and menacing. We've got some questions for you down at the station. Nina's pulse raced. This was it. They were going to try to silence her, but she wasn't going to make it easy for them. Get your hands off me, she snapped, jerking her arm away from Winters. I'm not under arrest, and you have no right to detain me. Winters' grip tightened. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice. Nina's mind raced. She needed a way out, but the door was blocked, and Sloane was watching her like a hawk. There was no way she could make it past Winters without a fight, and even if she did, she had no idea what was waiting for her outside. But then, an idea struck her. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone, and pressed a button on the side. The phone immediately lit up, and a faint beep sounded from the device. What the hell are you doing? Winters demanded, his eyes narrowing. Nina met his gaze, her expression defiant. I just activated my live stream. Everything you say or do from this point on is being broadcast live to my audience. For a moment, there was silence. Then Sloane's face twisted with anger. Shut it off, he ordered, his voice dangerously low. Nina shook her head. Too late. It's already out there. Winters' grip tightened on her arm, but Nina didn't flinch. She had called their bluff, and now it was up to them to decide how far they were willing to go. Sloane's eyes blazed with fury, but he remained silent, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gestured to Winters, who released Nina's arm, though his expression remained cold and threatening. Get out, Sloane said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. But don't think this is over, Ms. Roberts. You've made a powerful enemy today. Nina didn't waste any time. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had bought herself a little more time, but she knew that the real battle was just beginning. Nina stepped out of the hotel suite with her heart racing and her pulse pounding in her ears. She had managed to escape, but just barely. The threat hanging over her head was now very real, and it wasn't just the mayor or his cronies she had to worry about anymore. The whole situation had escalated beyond what she had originally imagined, and every second she stayed in the open, she was in danger. As she hurried down the hallway, she pulled her phone from her bag, her thumb hovering over the screen. The live stream had been a bluff. There was no actual broadcast. She had only activated a decoy alert, a tactic she'd used before in tight situations to buy herself time. But now she had to think quickly. The stakes were higher than ever, and Sloane would be preparing his next move. She rushed into the elevator and jabbed at the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, she finally let herself breathe. For now, she was safe. But how long could that last? She had exposed part of her hand, showing Sloane that she had enough evidence to rattle him. But what she had revealed was only a fraction of the story. The real bombshell was still hidden on the flash drive tucked inside her jacket, the one that contained details about Sloane's deepest connections and the involvement of Officer Winters and other high-ranking officials in a far-reaching criminal enterprise. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from an encrypted number one of her contacts. Change of plans. We need to meet now. Her pulse quickened. This contact had been crucial in helping her gather information about the mayor's dirty dealings, but their meetings were always planned in advance and meticulously coordinated. For them to reach out like this, with such urgency, meant something had shifted. Something big. Nina felt a wave of dread wash over her as she typed back a quick response where. The reply came almost instantly. The docks. Warehouse 7. Don't bring anyone. She frowned. The docks were the last place she wanted to go right now. They were isolated and far enough from the city's prying eyes that anything could happen there without anyone noticing. But she had no choice. If this contact had critical new information, she needed to hear it. And fast. The elevator doors opened, and Nina slipped out into the bustling hotel lobby, her mind racing. She needed to move quickly, but carefully. As she walked through the lobby, she glanced around, scanning the faces of the people passing by. No one seemed to be paying attention to her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She exited the hotel and hailed a cab, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror as the car weaved through the city streets. There was no sign of anyone following her, but that didn't ease her nerves. Sloane wasn't the type to send thugs in broad daylight. He was smarter than that, and so were the people he employed. They could be watching her from anywhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The cab pulled up to the docks, and Nina paid the driver, stepping out onto the worn, cracked pavement. The salty smell of the sea filled the air, mingling with the musty scent of the old warehouses that lined the water's edge. It was quiet here, too quiet. The docks were mostly abandoned at this time of day, and the wind whipped around her, making the empty shipping containers creak and groan. Nina walked quickly, heading toward Warehouse 7. Her heart pounded in her chest with each step, her senses on high alert. Something about this didn't feel right. The whole situation was off, but she couldn't afford to turn back now. She needed whatever information this contact had, especially if it could help her get ahead of Sloane and his team. The warehouse loomed in front of her, its large, rusted metal doors slightly ajar. Nina hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to be careful. But she pushed the feeling aside and slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, with shafts of sunlight streaming in through broken windows high above. Stacks of crates and shipping containers lined the walls, creating a maze of shadowy paths. Nina stood still for a moment, her ears straining for any sound. Then she heard it. Footsteps. She turned sharply, her hand reaching instinctively for the small recorder she kept in her bag. The footsteps grew louder, and soon a figure emerged from behind one of the stacks of crates. It was her contact, a man in his 40s, with a nervous energy about him. His eyes darted around the room, and he seemed jumpy, like he was expecting something bad to happen. "You made it," he said, his voice low and urgent. Nina nodded. "What's going on? Why the sudden meeting?" The man glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure they were alone. "Things are moving faster than we expected. Sloane's people know you're closing in. They're scrambling to cover their tracks, but it's worse than that. There's another player involved, someone bigger than Sloane, and they're pulling strings behind the scenes. They're getting desperate, and that makes them dangerous. Nina's stomach sank. Who? The man shook his head. I don't know. Not yet. But they're connected to the police. Sloane's just a pawn in this. He thinks he's in control, but he's not. They're using him to keep the heat off themselves. Nina clenched her fists. What about Winters? He's not just Sloane's enforcer. He's involved in this too, isn't he? The man hesitated, his face pale. Winters is more dangerous than we thought. He's not just following orders. He's been working with this other player for years, setting up the pieces, making sure they stay untouchable. If you expose him, you'll be exposing the whole operation. But it won't be easy. He's got dirt on everyone, and he won't go down without a fight. Nina's mind raced. This was bigger than she had imagined. Sloane was just a small part of a much larger scheme, one that involved not only the mayor's office but the police force itself, and Winters was right at the center of it. She took a step closer to her contact, lowering her voice. I need more. I need names, evidence, something I can use to bring them down. The man shook his head again, his expression tense. I can't give you that. Not yet. I'm still trying to get more information, but it's risky. If they find out I've been talking to you, I'm dead. Nina felt a surge of frustration. She was so close, but still so far from the full truth. Then why did you call me here? If you don't have what I need, what's the point? The man glanced around again, his nervousness palpable. Because they're coming for you. I overheard a conversation at the precinct. Winters is planning something. He's going to make sure you don't get the chance to publish what you have. They've got people watching you. It's only a matter of time before they make their move. Nina's heart skipped a beat. She had known the danger was real, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all the more immediate. How much time do I have? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head. Not much. Maybe hours. They're going to frame you for something. Make it look like you were involved in some kind of criminal activity. They've done it before, and they'll do it again. Nina's pulse raced. She needed to act fast. She had to get this story out before Winters and his people could move against her. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people she could trust. Okay, she said, her mind racing with plans. I'll handle it, but you need to keep digging. Find out who's behind this. I don't care how risky it is. We need to bring them all down. The man nodded, his face grim. I'll do what I can, but be careful, Nina. You're in deep now, deeper than you realize. Nina gave him a tight nod and turned to leave, her mind already calculating her next steps. But as she made her way toward the door, something caught her eye. A shadow moved behind one of the crates, and her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Before she could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. It was Winters. His cold, predatory eyes locked onto hers, and a slow, menacing smile spread across his face. Going somewhere, Roberts. Nina's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had faced down men like Winters before. She wasn't going to let him see her fear. Just wrapping up a meeting, she said, her voice steady. What about you? Following me again? Winters chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. You've been a busy woman. Too busy for your own good. Nina's hand instinctively moved toward her bag, but before she could reach for her phone, Winters lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrist and slamming her back against one of the crates. "You think you can keep playing this game?" he growled, his face inches from hers. "You think you can win?" Nina gritted her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. But inside, her mind was racing. She needed to get out of here, and fast. Winters wasn't going to let her walk away this time. Nina's body slammed hard against the cold metal crate, the force of it knocking the breath out of her. Winters loomed over her, his hand gripping her wrist like a vice. His cold, piercing eyes drilled into hers, and she could feel the raw aggression radiating off of him. He wasn't just following orders this time, this was personal. For a moment, Nina's mind blanked, but years of experience and instinct kicked in almost immediately. She couldn't afford to show fear, not to someone like Winters. If he saw even a flicker of doubt in her eyes, he'd pounce on it like a predator. She had to keep her composure. "You're making a mistake," Winters, Nina said, her voice sharp but steady, masking the pain shooting through her side. "I've already sent my files out. There's nothing you can do to stop this." It was a bluff, a desperate one. She hadn't sent everything out yet. The flash drive, the real damning evidence, was still hidden on her. But she hoped that the mere suggestion of exposure would buy her time, enough for her to figure out an escape. Winter's grip on her wrist tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Nice try," he sneered. "But we both know you're bluffing. You think you're untouchable because you're some hotshot journalist? You think you can keep poking around in things that don't concern you and just walk away?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "Let me make one thing clear. You're done, Roberts. You've gone too far this time." Nina's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him see her panic. She knew she had limited options here. Physically, Winters was much stronger, and there was no way she could overpower him in a direct confrontation. But she still had her mind, and she knew that words could be just as powerful as fists if used correctly. "You're right," she said, her voice calm, almost resigned. "I have gone too far, but so have you." Winter's eyes flickered with confusion, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable exterior. It was just a split second, but Nina seized it. She shifted slightly, using his distraction to pull her other hand free from her bag. In one swift motion, she pressed the small panic button on her watch, sending an emergency signal to her editor. "Now," she said, her tone icy, "either you let me go, or you'll be answering questions about why you're assaulting a journalist in an abandoned warehouse. There's a team on the way. They'll be here in minutes." Winter's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Nina thought he might actually call her bluff and escalate things. But then, with a snarl of frustration, he released her wrist and took a step back, glaring at her with unrestrained malice. "You think you're clever," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "But this isn't over. You're not walking out of this one unscathed." Nina rubbed her wrist, trying to ignore the throbbing pain as she took a step away from the crate. She didn't respond to his threat. There was no point in engaging with him any further. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on his as she slowly backed toward the door of the warehouse. She knew she had to get out of there as quickly as possible, but she couldn't afford to turn her back on Winters. Not yet. "Run all you want," Winters called after her, his voice echoing through the empty space. "But you won't get far. We've got eyes on you everywhere, Roberts, and next time you won't be so lucky." Nina didn't wait to hear anything else. She turned and bolted for the door, her heart racing as she burst out into the open air. The sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows across the docks, and the air had taken on a biting chill. She didn't have time to waste. Her car was parked a few blocks away, tucked into an alley between two old shipping offices. She sprinted toward it, her shoes slapping against the pavement as she fought the urge to look over her shoulder. Winters might not have followed her immediately, but she knew he wasn't far behind. And she had no idea how many other people were working with him or how many might be watching her right now. As she reached her car, she fumbled with her keys for a moment before finally unlocking the door and throwing herself inside. Her hands were shaking as she jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of Winters or his goons. Nothing. Not yet. Nina slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as she tore out of the alley and onto the main road. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could regroup and figure out her next move. But where? Her phone buzzed again, another message from her contact, the one who had warned her about Winters earlier. They know where you are. Get out of the city. Now. Nina's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She couldn't leave the city. Not yet. She still had too much to do, too much at stake. The flash drive in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a constant reminder of the truth she was carrying with her. The evidence she had gathered on Sloan and his corrupt network was enough to bring down not just him, but a whole web of criminal activity stretching across the city's most powerful institutions. And she knew that if she didn't act fast, all of it would be buried along with her. She needed help. Real help. And there was only one person left she could trust. Nina swerved onto a side street and hit the speed dial on her phone, her hands trembling as she pressed the call button. Pick up, she muttered under her breath, her heart racing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the line connected. Nina? What the hell is going on? It was Tom, her editor at the paper, and the only person she trusted to handle the situation. His voice was tense, filled with concern. Tom, Nina gasped, struggling to catch her breath. They know. Sloan's people, Winters, they're coming for me. I don't have much time. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Nina could hear the sound of typing in the background. Okay, slow down, Tom said, his voice calming but firm. Where are you now? Are you safe? For now, Nina said, glancing at the road behind her. But they've got people everywhere. I'm not sure how long I can stay ahead of them. You've got the files, right? The evidence. Yes, Nina replied, her voice tight. But it's not enough. I need something bigger, something that ties Winters and Sloan directly to this new player. There's someone else pulling the strings, Tom. Someone powerful, and we need to find out who it is before it's too late. Tom was silent for a moment, and Nina could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. He was a veteran journalist, someone who had seen it all, but even he sounded rattled. Okay, he finally said. Listen to me, Nina. We can't go public with this yet. Not until we have everything. You need to lay low for a while, regroup. I'll reach out to some contacts, see if we can find out who's backing Sloan. But you need to be careful. If Winters is involved, it's only going to get more dangerous from here. I don't have time, Tom, Nina said, frustration creeping into her voice. They're going to frame me for something. Winters is planning it right now. If I don't move fast, they'll destroy everything, my career, the evidence, everything. I know, Tom said, his voice urgent. But if you get caught or worse, none of this will matter. You've got to trust me on this. We'll take them down, but we have to be smart about it. Nina wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but deep down she knew he was right. She couldn't go head-to-head with Winters and Sloan on her own. She needed time to regroup, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle. Okay, she said finally, her voice heavy with reluctance. But I'm not running. I'll lay low for now, but we need to move fast. If they get to me before I can get this out, it's over. I'll do everything I can, Tom promised. Get somewhere safe, and I'll contact you when I have more information. Nina hung up, her mind spinning. She knew she couldn't just sit back and wait for someone else to solve this for her. If she was going to survive and take down Sloane, she had to stay one step ahead of them. And that meant she needed to find out who this new player was, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. As she drove through the darkening streets, her mind raced with possibilities. Who was powerful enough to manipulate both the mayor's office and the police force? And why had they let Sloane and Winters run things for so long? Whoever it was, they had to be deeply embedded in the city's power structure. And that meant they had resources, connections, and the ability to eliminate threats without leaving a trace. Nina's phone buzzed again. Another message, but this time it wasn't from her contact or Tom. It was an unknown number. We need to talk. You're not safe. I can help you. Nina's pulse quickened. She hesitated for a moment before responding. Who is this? The reply came almost immediately. Someone who knows more than you think. Meet me at Pier 13, tonight. Nina stared at the screen, her mind racing. This could be a trap, another attempt to lure her into a dangerous situation. But what if it wasn't? What if this person had the information she needed to finally bring down Sloane and his network? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed a response. I'll be there. She threw her phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Pier 13 was on the edge of the docks, a desolate, run-down area that had been abandoned for years. It was the perfect place for a covert meeting and the perfect place for an ambush. But Nina knew she didn't have a choice. If this person really did have the answers she needed, she couldn't afford to ignore the opportunity. She'd have to take the risk, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. As she turned her car toward the docks, a chill ran down her spine. The night was closing in, and so were her enemies. But she wasn't backing down. Not yet. The cold, salty air stung Nina's face as she made her way toward Pier 13, the desolate docks barely visible under the dim, flickering streetlights. The wind whipped around her, carrying with it the eerie creaks of the aging pier, a sound that only amplified her growing sense of dread. She clutched her jacket tighter around her, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. This was the meeting place, the spot where her mysterious contact had instructed her to come. But so far, it was nothing but empty, quiet shadows. She wasn't naive. Nina knew this could be a trap. Her every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to abandon this risky rendezvous and disappear into the city. But she was in too deep now. There was no turning back. Whoever had contacted her claimed to have information that could blow open the entire case, evidence that could not only tie Sloane and Winters directly to the criminal network, but reveal the identity of the real power behind it all. She needed that information. It was her only chance to survive, to bring the truth to light before they could bury her for good. She reached the end of the pier, her breath coming in short, tense bursts as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The water below lapped softly against the wooden beams, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. For a moment, Nina thought she was alone, that this whole thing had been a setup, designed to leave her stranded and vulnerable. But then she saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, tall and cloaked in darkness. The person approached slowly, their face obscured by a hood, their steps deliberate and measured. Nina's pulse quickened as she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her small voice recorder just in case. Roberts the figure called out, their voice low and hoarse, barely audible above the wind. You alone. Nina narrowed her eyes, trying to make out more details of the person standing in front of her. That depends, she said, her voice steady but guarded. Who are you? Why should I trust you? The figure stepped closer, lowering the hood to reveal a man's face. He was older, in his 50s, with thinning grey hair and a hard, weathered expression. His eyes were sharp, calculating and filled with a kind of wariness that set Nina on edge. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he carried himself like a man who had seen too much, who had survived too long in the shadows. Name's Logan, he said, his voice gruff. I used to work with Sloan. Did a lot of things I'm not proud of. But I'm done with that now. Done with him. I've got information that can take him down, but it's too dangerous to keep on me. I need your help. Nina's eyes flicked over him, her skepticism rising. Why should I believe you? If you worked with Sloan, why turn on him now? Logan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Because I'm tired of being someone else's pawn. I've seen what Sloan's capable of. I've seen how deep his ties go, how many people he's willing to bury to keep himself in power. And I'm not going down with him. Not when I can make things right. Nina crossed her arms, her mind racing as she weighed his words. There was a desperation in his voice, but also something else, a sense of resignation, like a man who knew his days were numbered. She could feel the truth in his tone, but she wasn't about to trust him completely. Not yet. Andy. Okay, Nina said carefully. You said you had evidence. Show me. Logan glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Then, with a grim nod, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He handed it to Nina, his hand shaking slightly as he did so. Everything you need is in there, he said quietly. Financial records, wire transfers, names, dates. Sloan's been moving money through offshore accounts, funneling it into shell companies that he controls through intermediaries. But he's not doing it alone. Winters is in on it too. He's been using his connections in the police force to cover up any loose ends, making sure no one asks the wrong questions. And it goes even deeper than that. Nina took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it, and quickly skimmed the documents inside. It was all there, the paper trail she needed to tie Sloan and Winters directly to the criminal enterprise. But one name kept appearing, one she didn't recognize. Who's this? She asked, pointing to the unfamiliar name scrawled across several of the documents. Logan's expression darkened. That's the real power behind Sloan. His name's Mercer. He's been running the whole operation from the shadows. He's got connections you wouldn't believe, city officials, law enforcement, even judges. Sloan's just the face. Mercer's the one pulling the strings. Nina's stomach tightened. This was bigger than she had imagined. Mercer, a name she had never heard before, was the mastermind behind everything. He had been operating in the background, using Sloan as a puppet while controlling the city from the shadows. Where can I find him? Nina asked, her voice hard. Logan shook his head. You can't. He's too well protected. If you go after him, you'll disappear before you even get close. The only way to bring him down is through Sloan and Winters. Expose them, and the whole thing collapses. Nina closed the envelope, her mind spinning. She finally had the key to take down Sloan, Winters, and their entire network, but it came with a heavy price. Mercer was out there, and if she moved against his pawns, he'd come for her with everything he had. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the air, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Nina's heart lurched in her chest as Logan staggered backward, clutching his side. Blood blossomed across his coat as he stumbled and fell to the ground, his face contorted in pain. Logan Nina dropped to her knees beside him, panic surging through her veins. She pressed her hand against his wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, but it was bad. Too bad. Logan's eyes fluttered open, his breathing ragged. "Run," he rasped, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth. "They're here." Before Nina could react, headlights blazed through the darkness, and the sound of tires screeching against the pavement filled the air. A black SUV barreled toward the pier, its engine roaring. Nina's heart raced as she stood up, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Logan was dying in front of her, and the people coming were the ones responsible. Another gunshot rang out, and the sound of metal pinging off the crates nearby snapped Nina back to reality. She shoved the envelope into her jacket and bolted for cover, her legs pumping as she ducked behind a stack of crates, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The SUV screeched to a halt, and the doors flew open. Armed men poured out, their faces obscured by masks, their guns drawn. Nina pressed herself against the cold metal of the crate, her mind racing. They were hunting her now, and she had nowhere to go. But she wasn't going down without a fight. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she sent a quick message to Tom. "Pier 13, send help. Now." Her only hope was that he'd get the message in time. The men moved quickly, their footsteps heavy on the wooden planks of the pier, as they fanned out, searching for her. Nina's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. She couldn't let them find her. Not now. Not when she was so close. She peeked around the edge of the crate, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them closing in. She needed a distraction, something to buy her time. Her eyes darted around the area, landing on an old, rusted fuel tank a few yards away. It was a long shot, but it was the only option she had. Steeling herself, Nina reached into her bag and pulled out her small emergency flare. She took a deep breath and lit it, the bright, sizzling light illuminating the dark pyre. With a swift motion, she hurled the flare toward the fuel tank and ducked back behind the crates. The explosion was deafening. The fireball erupted into the sky, sending a shockwave through the pier. The men shouted in confusion, their attention immediately drawn to the blaze. It was the opening Nina needed. Without wasting a second, she bolted from her hiding spot and sprinted toward the water's edge, her feet pounding against the wooden planks. The envelope was still tucked safely inside her jacket, and with every step, she knew she was one step closer to exposing Sloan, Winters, and their entire operation. But she wasn't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. Nina's legs burned as she sprinted along the pier, her breath ragged and desperate. Behind her, the flames from the explosion roared, casting long shadows across the dock. The armed men, momentarily distracted by the blast, were now regrouping, barking orders at each other as they searched for her. She didn't have much time. The water stretched out in front of her, black and endless. She had no choice but to keep running, to keep moving toward the edge of the pier, hoping against hope that her signal had reached Tom and that help was on its way. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of the envelope inside her jacket growing heavier with each passing second. Suddenly she heard footsteps heavy, fast, and gaining on her. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw one of the masked men, his gun raised, charging after her. Her heart leaped into her throat as she pushed herself harder, the edge of the pier looming closer. Just as she reached the end, she felt a hand grab the back of her jacket, yanking her backward with brutal force. She hit the ground hard, her head slamming against the wooden planks, stars exploding in her vision. Dazed, she tried to scramble to her feet, but the man was on her in an instant, his knee pressing into her chest as he reached for the envelope. "Where do you think you're going with that?" he snarled, his voice muffled behind the mask. Nina struggled beneath him, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She couldn't let him take the evidence. She couldn't let them bury the truth. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she lashed out, driving her knee into his side. The man grunted in pain, momentarily loosening his grip on her. That was all the opening she needed. Nina twisted out from under him, rolling to the side as she grabbed a broken piece of wood lying nearby. Without hesitation, she swung it at him, catching him across the face. The man staggered back, stunned, giving Nina just enough time to get back on her feet. She didn't wait for him to recover. With adrenaline surging through her veins, she ran toward the very end of the pier. There was nowhere left to go. The cold, dark water stretched out before her like an abyss. Behind her, the man was already recovering, shouting for the others. With no other option, Nina made a split-second decision. She jumped. "Huh!" The icy water enveloped her instantly, the shock of it stealing the breath from her lungs. She sank beneath the surface, the weight of her jacket pulling her down as the roar of the flames and shouts from the dock became muffled, distant. For a moment, everything was silent. The world around her seemed to slow as she fought to orient herself, her arms and legs moving instinctively as she kicked toward the surface. When she broke through the water, gasping for air, she could hear the chaos above her, the shouts of the men, the crackle of the fire, the sound of more vehicles approaching. But something else caught her attention, something that sent a jolt of hope through her chest. Sirens. Grr. Nina swam toward a nearby boat docked at the edge of the pier, her limbs heavy from the cold and exhaustion. She pulled herself up, gasping for breath as she clung to the side of the boat. From her vantage point, she could see the flashing lights of police cars and unmarked vehicles speeding toward the pier. Tom had come through. Help had arrived. On the dock, the armed men were scrambling to escape, their plan falling apart as law enforcement descended on them. Nina watched as officers flooded the area, shouting orders and apprehending the men one by one. The gunman who had chased her was tackled to the ground, his weapon knocked from his hand as he was handcuffed and dragged away. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. There was still one more loose end, Sloan and Winters. As she sat there, shivering and drenched, her phone buzzed inside her waterlogged jacket. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she wiped the screen. It was a message from Tom. "Sloan's trying to flee. Federal agents intercepted his car. Winters is with him." Nina felt a surge of adrenaline. They had been caught, but that didn't mean they were done fighting. Sloan had been slippery for years and Winters was as ruthless as they came. If they were trying to run, it meant they still believed they could escape this. She couldn't let that happen. With a newfound sense of determination, Nina climbed out of the boat and made her way back toward the pier. By the time she reached the dock, federal agents were already swarming the area, loading the captured men into vans. She spotted Tom standing near one of the vehicles, his face pale but determined as he gave orders to the team. When he saw her, his expression softened with relief. "Nina," he called out, rushing over to her. "Jesus, are you okay?" Nina nodded, though she could still feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "Did they get Sloan?" Tom nodded grimly. "Yeah, they're taking him in now. Winters too. It's over. Nina exhaled slowly, the tension in her body finally releasing. It was over. The months of digging, the constant threats, the narrow escapes, it had all led to this moment. Sloane and Winters were going to face justice. The city would finally know the truth about the corruption that had poisoned its leaders. But as she looked out over the pier, her eyes still scanning the chaos, a strange feeling settled over her. This wasn't the end. Not really. Mercer, the shadowy figure who had been pulling the strings, was still out there. She had exposed the mayor and his enforcer, but the real mastermind had yet to be brought to light. Nina turned to Tom, her voice steady but resolute. There's more to this, Tom. Mercer, the one who's really behind all of this, he's still out there. We need to keep going. Tom frowned, looking at her with concern. Nina, you've been through enough. Let the feds handle it from here. But Nina shook her head. No, this is bigger than Sloane or Winters. If we stop now, Mercer will just replace them. The city needs to know the full truth. Tom studied her for a moment before nodding. Okay, he said quietly. We'll keep digging. But for now, let's get you out of here. You've earned a break. Nina nodded, exhaustion finally settling over her. As she walked with Tom toward one of the waiting cars, she cast one last look back at the pier. The fire had been extinguished, the chaos subdued, but the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning.